Good morning. So now we get to the wild world of glazing. We have a bisqued pot, which has been fired up to about 1800 degrees. It's basically stone. It's like a not quite crumbly, but it's a fairly porous stone. Completely different item than anything clay. And at this point, this is called ceramic rather than clay, because it can't be reconstituted any longer. So far I have painted my bird and sanded that off and added the squigglies that I kind of loosely think of as a signature, and I'm ready to glaze. And volumes of books have been written about glazing, and we can't get into that here, but suffice it to say that for this one I'm going to put one glaze on the interior and another glaze on the exterior, and I just want to show the process of application, and I'll talk about water probably in my intro if you're interested, because it's actually fascinating when you think about water as it relates to glazing and this stage of the process. So here I've got a dark blue, and this guy is not the same as our family because I'm actually glazing him a little later because he went into a later bisque firing. But I'm going to take a dark blue, a midnight blue, just going to pour it onto the inside. Give it a slow count, and I'm going to dump it out. And I'm going to dip just the top down to a line in the dark blue. That I'm going to have to let sort of sit for a bit, and I'm going to have to do a couple of adjustments. A little drip here, which I'm going to address. Didn't quite get down to that line. Do I care? Kind of care, so I think I'm going to dip it one more time there at the lip. Sponge it here to keep a kind of nice sharp line at the top. And then I'm going to use another glaze, something I call half and half, which is a softer blue. And this is a blue that was used in the family of pots. And when this sort of dries enough to the touch, which will take a minute, then I'll be dipping it into this other glaze at the base. But first I have to be able to touch this without having it come off in my hand. So that will take 1 second, which, let me use this to talk about water. So for people who study ceramic science, there are actually 3 types of water, or H2O, and H2O becomes important because some of the water we think about in clay is not water at all. It's a chemical H2O that is literally bonded in the other materials that make up a clay body. So not to get into the specifics, but you can look at a formula for a clay body, and in that formula you'll often find, or maybe always find, H2O as a chemical component literally within the particles itself. So I can touch this pot and it feels completely dry, but in fact it still has water bound into the clay itself. So in the bisque firing, what happened was that water was burned off, so the pot then shrinks because it's losing some of its core chemical components. So that's the deal with water. I'm now going to dip this into this other glaze here, making sure I reach the same level. I've waxed the bottom because you don't want glaze obviously on the bottom. If you have glaze on the bottom, it's just going to stick to the shelf, and then you have a real mess. So that, very roughly, is the glazing process. But it is full of tricks and tripwires. So it's its own sort of area of needing to learn subtleties of how to do it without having it drip, because glazes are sensitive once they're fired to thickness. The thickness of a glaze, for instance, here there's a very slight drip. I may sand that down later, I may not. But the thickness of a glaze will control a couple things, whether it drips onto the kiln shelf, in which case you have kind of ruined your pot. But it also can change and modulate color. The thicker the glaze, obviously, the deeper the color. So sometimes you want it thin, so it's rather translucent, and some glazes are opaque, some are translucent. But the more thick you get it, it may deepen and enrich that color. And if you get it too thick, it's just going to drip and look globby. So it's a bit of a subtle moment here. And you've got to wipe the glaze off the base, obviously, and then you put it into the fire. Okay, that's a little basics. Thanks.